I'm here to find my father, the little girl said. Daniel Whitmore looked down at her. Who is your father? He asked. My father works for you, sir, the girl said. His name is Samuel Reed. He's your driver. Daniel's eyes shifted slightly. He knew the name. Reed had been his private driver for nearly 2 years. Quiet, punctual, never caused problems. And why are you here instead of in school? Daniel asked. The girl held her hands together tightly. Because my mama is very sick, sir. She wants to see my daddy. So I came to bring him home. Before Daniel could respond, another voice came from behind him. That's not possible. Daniel turned. His son, Ethan Whitmore, was walking down the steps, car keys in hand, dressed for class, confident and practical in the way young men who had grown up around power often were. If her father is Samuel Reed, then he can't just leave, Ethan said. He took advance salary. If you take advance salary, you work until the contract is finished. That's the agreement. Daniel frowned slightly. Advance salary? Ethan looked surprised. You didn't know? Mom approved it last year. Reed needed money for his wife's medical treatment. He asked for 2 years' salary in advance. Mom signed the approval. Legal made the contract. He agreed to work full-time, no long leave, until the 2 years are completed. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. Your mother approved this? Yes, Ethan said. It was legal and fair. If people take money and then leave, the company loses. You always say business only works if rules are followed. The little girl listened, not understanding everything, but understanding one thing very clearly. They were saying her father could not come home. My daddy said he would work, she said quickly. He works every day. He calls us at night and says when the 2 years finish, he will come home. But now my mama is very sick. She said she is scared she might not see him again. So I came to ask if he can come home just for a little while. Then he will come back and work again. He promised. Ethan shook his head. That's not how contracts work. If he leaves and doesn't come back, who replaces him? We can't run a company based on promises. The girl turned back to Daniel, the one person she believed could change everything. Sir, she said softly, my daddy is a good man. He will come back. He just wants to see my mama. Daniel did not answer immediately. Then, at that exact moment, the sound of a car engine came up the long driveway. All of them turned. A black sedan rolled slowly toward the front steps and stopped. The driver's door opened, and Samuel Reed stepped out, then quickly moved to open the back door. Daniel's wife stepped out of the car, thanking him as she always did, already looking down at her phone. Not yet noticing what was happening on the steps, Samuel closed the door gently, then turned and froze. Annie had already started running. Daddy, she cried. Samuel's face drained of color. Annie, what are you doing here? She ran straight into him and wrapped her arms around his waist. He dropped to his knees immediately, holding her shoulders, panic all over his face. You're supposed to be in school. Why are you here? Is your mother okay? Is something wrong? Annie looked at him, trying to be brave, trying not to cry. Mama is in the hospital. She said she wants to see you, so I came to bring you home. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, pain and fear crossing his face in a way Daniel had never seen before. When he opened them again, he seemed to remember where he was. He stood up quickly and turned toward Daniel. I'm sorry, sir, Samuel said immediately. I didn't know she would come. I told my wife I can't leave yet. I still have months left on the contract. I'm very sorry if she caused trouble. I will take her back right now. Annie grabbed his hand tightly. Daddy? Mama said she is very tired now. She said she wants to see you. Samuel's hand trembled in his daughter's grip, but he did not look at her. He looked at Daniel. Sir, he said quietly, I signed the contract. I took the advance. I will finish my time. I gave my word. Ethan spoke from the steps, his voice calm and logical. That's the agreement, Mr. Reed. You took 2 years' salary in advance. The company relied on that agreement. If every employee left whenever they had family problems, the company couldn't function. Samuel nodded slowly. Yes, sir, I understand. Annie looked from Ethan to her father to Daniel. not fully understanding contracts or companies or obligations. She only understood that the adults were talking in a way that meant her father might not come home. She stepped forward and gently held onto Daniel's coat sleeve with her small hand. "Sir," she whispered, "my daddy will come back. He just goes home a little while, just to see my mama. Please." Daniel looked down at her hand on his sleeve. Then he looked at Samuel Reed, a man who clearly wanted to run to his sick wife but was standing perfectly still because of a contract and a promise. Then he looked at his son, who was watching him carefully, waiting to see if his father would follow the rules he had taught him his entire life. For a long moment, no one spoke. Daniel Whitmore looked at Samuel Reed for a long moment in silence. Then at the girl standing beside him, then at his son Ethan, and finally at his wife Margaret. "Everyone inside," Daniel said calmly. "We're not discussing this on the front steps." Margaret nodded slightly, relieved. Ethan said nothing, but he followed. Samuel hesitated, as if unsure whether he was allowed to step through the front door of the main house instead of the staff entrance. "Inside, Reed," Daniel repeated. "Bring your daughter." They walked into the large entrance hall. Annie stayed close to her father, her hand holding onto his sleeve as if she was afraid someone might change their mind and send them away. Daniel led them into a sitting room just off the main hall. It was a warm room, with dark wood shelves, leather chairs, and a fireplace that had already been lit by the house staff that morning. Daniel gestured for them to sit. Samuel did not sit at first. "Sir, I can stand." "Sit," Daniel said. "This is not a work meeting. This is a conversation." Samuel sat slowly on the edge of the chair. Annie sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, looking from one adult to another, waiting. Daniel remained standing for a moment, then finally sat across from them. "I want you to start from the beginning," Daniel said. "Everything. Don't leave anything out. I want to understand how this happened." Samuel took a deep breath. His hands were rough, the hands of a man who worked with them, not a man who only signed papers. "My wife got sick last year," Samuel began. "Cancer. The insurance covered some, but not all. The treatments were expensive. I tried to work more, take extra shifts, but it wasn't enough. The hospital said if we didn't start treatment right away, it would be too late." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I went to HR and asked if there was any way I could borrow money against my salary. They said it would have to be approved. A week later, they told me Mrs. Whitmore approved in advance. I was very grateful, sir. That money saved my wife's life at that time." Margaret spoke softly. "I remember approving financial assistance. I did not know they would change your work conditions like this." Samuel nodded respectfully. "Ma'am, I signed the papers. I agreed to the terms. They said if I took the advance, I had to commit to working full-time until the money was paid back. No long leave, no extended time away. I agreed because I didn't have another choice." Daniel leaned back slightly, listening. "I told my wife it would only be 2 years, Samuel continued. "I told her when the 2 years were finished, I would come home and everything would be normal again. I called every night. I sent all my money home. I thought we just had to survive 2 years." Annie looked down at her hands, then spoke quietly. "Mama got worse last month. She tries to sound normal on the phone, but I can hear she is tired. Last night she said she wanted to see Daddy. She said she didn't want to be alone if—" Annie stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "So I came here this morning to ask if Daddy could come home, just for a little while." Ethan shifted slightly in his chair but did not interrupt this time. Daniel looked at Samuel. "Why didn't you come talk to me directly?" Samuel answered honestly. "Sir, men in my position don't usually come directly to men in your position. We follow the chain of command. And I signed the contract. I gave my word. I was raised to believe that a man keeps his word, even when it's hard." Daniel nodded slowly. That was an answer he understood. "You believed you were not allowed to leave," Daniel said. "Yes, sir. And if you left to see your wife, what did you think would happen?" "They said I could be sued for the full advance immediately," Samuel said. "I don't have that kind of money, sir. I would lose everything. My house, my wife's treatment, my daughter's future. So I stayed and worked." Daniel was silent for a long time after that. Finally, He stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames for a few seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but there was something different in it now. "Reed," he said, "look at me." Samuel stood immediately. "Yes, sir." Daniel turned to face him. "You're going home," Daniel said. Samuel blinked, as if he had not heard correctly. "Sir, you're going home today," Daniel repeated. "You're going to the hospital. You're going to sit with your wife, and you're going to stay as long as your family needs you." Samuel stared at him, unable to speak. Ethan stood up. "Dad." Daniel raised a hand slightly, and Ethan stopped talking. "The contract will be reviewed," Daniel continued. "The advance will be handled. That is not your problem right now. Your problem right now is that your wife is in a hospital bed, and your daughter had to take a bus alone to come ask your employer for permission to see her own father." Samuel's eyes were red now, but he was still trying to stand straight like an employee instead of a husband and a father. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. Daniel shook his head slightly. "Don't thank me. Just go home." Annie looked up at Daniel, as if she was trying to make sure she understood correctly. "Daddy can come home?" she asked. Daniel looked at her and nodded once. "Yes, your father is going home. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your support helps this channel reach more people who believe in kindness, justice, and the power of family. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. For the first time since she arrived, Annie smiled. It was not a big smile, just a small one, but it changed her entire face. She reached for her father's hand again and held it tightly. Samuel cleared his throat, still overwhelmed. "Sir, I promise I will come back to work as soon as—" "Reed," Daniel said gently but firmly. "Right now, you are not speaking to your boss. You are speaking to a man who is telling you to go be with your family." Samuel lowered his head. "Yes, sir." Daniel walked to the desk near the wall, wrote something quickly on a card, and handed it to Samuel. "This is my direct number," Daniel said. "When you get to the hospital, you call me and tell me what your wife needs, not what the contract says. What your wife needs. Do you understand me?" Samuel took the card with both hands. "Yes, sir, I understand." As Samuel and Annie prepared to leave the room, Annie turned back once more. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. When Samuel Reed and his daughter left the Whitmore estate that morning, the house felt strangely quiet, as if something important had passed through its doors and left the air changed behind it. Daniel stood in the entrance hall for a long time after the front door closed. He could hear the faint sound of the car engine as Samuel drove away, probably faster than he had ever driven Daniel to any meeting or airport. A man driving toward his family did not drive the same way as a man driving his employer. Behind him, Ethan spoke first. "You just broke a signed contract, Dad." Daniel did not turn around immediately. "No," he said calmly. "I corrected a mistake." Ethan frowned. "It wasn't a mistake. It was an agreement. He took money. He works until it's paid back. That's how the world works." Daniel turned now and looked at his son carefully. "That's how business works. That's not always how life works." Ethan crossed his arms. "If word gets out that employees can get out of contracts by showing up with a sad story, you're going to have a line of people at that gate." Daniel nodded slightly. "Maybe we should ask why they would feel the need to stand at that gate in the first place." Ethan didn't have an answer for that, so he said nothing more. Margaret, who had been standing quietly near the stairs, finally spoke. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Daniel looked at her. "Did I?" She nodded. "Yes, but I think the real question is not Reed. The real question is who wrote that contract the way it was written." Daniel didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said he was already thinking the same thing. He went back to his office, closed the door, and placed Samuel Reed's contract on his desk again. He read every line slowly. This time not as a CEO looking at legal language, but as a man trying to understand how another man had lived for 2 years under the weight of those words. 2 years, 730 days. Driving, waiting, opening doors, carrying bags, standing outside restaurants in the cold, sleeping in a small room above the garage, calling home at night and telling his wife and daughter that everything would be okay when the contract ended. Daniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered being 22 years old, working loading docks in winter, saving every dollar, sending money back to his own mother. He remembered what it felt like to be tired all the time and still say yes when the boss asked you to work another shift because you needed the job more than you needed sleep. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said. Mark stepped in. "Sir, I spoke with the hospital. Mrs. Reed is stable. The doctors say the treatment is working, but she needs continued therapy and rest. It's serious, but not as critical as they feared last night." Daniel felt something in his chest loosen slightly, though he didn't show it. "So she's not dying?" "No, sir, not immediately, but she is very weak. The doctor said family support is important right now." "Family support," Daniel nodded once. "Good. Make sure Reed knows his job is secure while he's gone." "Yes, sir. And Mark," Daniel added, "I want a full review of all employee advance contracts. Every department, every manager. I want to know if Reed is the only one working under terms like this." Mark hesitated. "Sir, if we start digging into operations, we may find things the board won't like." Daniel's expression didn't change. "Then the board should prepare to be unhappy." Mark gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." After Mark left, Daniel stood and walked to the window again. The driveway was empty now. The morning had returned to its normal rhythm: deliveries, gardeners, staff moving between buildings. But Daniel could not stop thinking about one thing Annie had said. "My daddy said you are a fair man. That's why I came to ask you." He said the words quietly to himself now, testing how they sounded in the silence of his office. A fair man. It was a strange thing to be judged by a child you had never met, especially when that child believed something about you that you were not entirely sure was true. That afternoon, Ethan came into his office again, this time without the confidence he had shown that morning. "I talked to some people in operations," Ethan said, "about the advance contracts." "And?" Daniel asked. Ethan shifted his weight slightly. "Reed isn't the only one. There are others. Mostly drivers, maintenance staff, a few warehouse guys, people who needed money for medical bills, immigration lawyers, family problems. They take advances, and then the contracts get tighter." "Tighter," Daniel repeated. "More restrictions," Ethan said. "More penalties if they leave. Longer required hours. It's all technically legal." Daniel looked at his son for a long moment. "Do you still think this is just how the world works?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He walked to the window and looked out at the same driveway his father had been staring at all morning. "I think," Ethan said slowly, "that I never really thought about the people who work for us as people with lives. I just thought of them as employees." Daniel nodded slightly. "That's because it's easy to care about numbers. Numbers don't have families." They stood there in silence for a while, father and son, looking out at the property that had given them everything: money, security, power, comfort. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "That little girl," he said. "She wasn't afraid of you." Daniel almost smiled, but not quite. "No," he said. "She wasn't. Everyone else is," Ethan said. Daniel looked at his reflection in the glass. A 40-year-old billionaire in a tailored suit, standing in a house too big for one man, running a company that employed thousands of people whose names he would never know. But one of them had a daughter who believed he was a fair man. And that belief, Daniel realized, might be more dangerous than any lawsuit, any board meeting, or any business deal he had ever faced, because now he had to decide whether or not he was going to become the man that child already believed he was. That evening, the Whitmore house was quieter than usual. Daniel sat alone in the dining room, a long polished table set for 3, even though only 2 people lived in the house now that Ethan spent most of his time at the university. The house staff moved quietly, placing plates, pouring water, lighting the small candles Margaret liked to have at dinner even when it was just family. Margaret sat across from him, unfolding her napkin slowly. She watched her husband for a moment before speaking. "You've been thinking about that family all day," she said. Daniel didn't deny it. "Yes. She's not dying," Margaret said gently. "I spoke to the hospital myself this afternoon. The doctors think the treatment is working. She'll need months of recovery, but there's hope." Daniel nodded. "That's good." Margaret studied him. "But that's not what's bothering you, is it?" Daniel put his fork down, not yet touching the food. "No," he said. What's bothering me is that a man worked for me for 2 years believing he wasn't allowed to go home to see his own wife, and I didn't know." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "We have thousands of employees, Daniel. You can't know every detail of every contract." Daniel looked at her. "I don't need to know every detail, but I should know if the system I built is trapping people who work for me." Margaret did not argue with that. She had known Daniel long enough to recognize the tone in his voice. When he spoke like this, it meant he had already made a decision in his mind. The rest of the world just hadn't caught up yet. Ethan joined them a few minutes later, still in his university clothes, his expression thoughtful instead of confident like usual. They ate in silence for a while before Ethan finally said, "I went to the garage this afternoon." Daniel looked up. "And I talked to some of the drivers," Ethan said. "Not as the boss's son, just as someone asking questions." "And what did they say?" Ethan hesitated. "They all know about the advance contracts. They call them golden handcuffs." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Golden handcuffs?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "They say it helps when someone has a big problem, medical bills, family emergencies, but once you take the money, you belong to the schedule. You don't say no to shifts. You don't ask for time off unless it's an emergency. And even then, most of them don't ask because they're afraid of losing the job." Margaret put her fork down slowly. "That's not what I intended when I approved those advances." Ethan nodded. "I know, but that's what it became." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "And Reed? They all respect him," Ethan said. "They said he never complained, never traded shifts, never asked for special treatment. They said he worked more than anyone." Daniel looked down at his plate but did not see it. In his mind, he saw a different image. Samuel Reed standing beside the car every morning, opening the door, saying, "Good morning, sir," in the same calm voice every single day while carrying a problem Daniel had never bothered to see. "Dad," Ethan said quietly, "did you really not know about the no-leave clause?" "No," Daniel said. "If I had known, I would have changed it." Ethan studied his father's face, trying to decide whether he believed that. After a moment, he realized he did. "What are you going to do?" Ethan asked. Daniel answered without hesitation, "I'm going to fix it." The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office earlier than usual. The headquarters of Whitmore Logistics and Security was a glass and steel building in Stamford, overlooking the harbor. From the outside, it looked like success: clean lines, polished floors, quiet elevators, people in suits moving with purpose. Inside the top-floor conference room, the senior management team was already waiting when Daniel walked in. Richard Cole from operations, 2 HR executives, the legal director, and the CFO. They all knew this was not a routine meeting. Daniel Whitmore did not call early morning meetings unless something important was about to change. Daniel did not sit immediately. He stood at the head of the table and placed Samuel Reed's contract in front of him. "I want to talk about employee advance contracts," Daniel said. Richard Cole spoke first, confident as always. "Sir, if this is about Reed, the contract is fully legal. Our lawyers—" Daniel raised his hand slightly. Richard stopped talking. "I am not asking whether it is legal," Daniel said calmly. "I am asking whether it is right." No one spoke. Daniel opened the contract and slid it across the table toward them. This man believed he was not allowed to visit his sick wife because of this document. "He worked for me every day while his family fell apart somewhere else, and none of you thought that was a problem worth mentioning." The HR director shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, many employees prefer strict contracts. It guarantees repayment and job security." Daniel looked at her. "Job security is not supposed to mean personal imprisonment." Richard leaned forward slightly. "With respect, Daniel, we are running a business, not a charity. If we start letting personal situations override contracts, we lose structure. And structure is what made this company successful." Daniel finally sat down, folding his hands on the table. "Structure is important," he said. "But structure without humanity becomes exploitation." The room was very quiet now. "I built this company from nothing," Daniel continued, "and I did it with people like Samuel Reed. Drivers, warehouse workers, mechanics, security staff, people who showed up every day and did their jobs so this company could grow. If the price of that growth is that they cannot go home when their families need them, then something is wrong with the system. Richard's voice hardened slightly. If we change these policies, we risk losing money. Daniel met his eyes. We can earn more money. We cannot earn back our integrity once we lose it. No one argued after that. Daniel pushed the contract back toward them. Effective immediately, I want a new policy. Any employee who takes an advance will have a structured repayment plan through payroll. But they will not lose basic personal leave. No one in this company will ever again believe they are trapped here because they needed help. The legal director nodded slowly, already making notes. And one more thing, Daniel added. I want a fund set up. Emergency medical assistance for employees and their immediate families. Quietly. No publicity. No press releases. Just help when it's needed. Richard looked at him carefully. This will change the company. Daniel nodded once. Yes, he said. It will. As the meeting ended and the executives began to file out, Daniel remained seated for a moment, looking at the city through the glass wall. Yesterday morning, a child had stood at his gate and asked him for help. Today, he had just changed a policy that would affect thousands of people he would never meet. And for the first time in many years, Daniel Whitmore felt like he had done something that would not show up on a financial report but might matter more than anything that ever had. The call from Samuel Reed came that afternoon. Just as Daniel was finishing another meeting he barely remembered afterward. Daniel saw the number on his phone, stepped out of the conference room, and answered immediately. Reed. Sir, Samuel's voice came through, tired but steadier than it had been that morning. I'm at the hospital. How is your wife? Daniel asked. There was a small pause, the kind that happens when someone is choosing their words carefully so they don't break while speaking. She's weak, Samuel said, but the doctor says the treatment is working. They caught the infection early this time. She's going to need time. But she's not leaving us. Not now. Daniel leaned slightly against the wall, exhaling quietly. That's good. Yes, sir, Samuel said. It's very good. She was asking for Annie and me this morning. When we walked into the room, he stopped, then continued more quietly. Sir, I don't think I will ever forget that moment for the rest of my life. Daniel said nothing, letting the man speak. She kept saying she thought she was dreaming. Samuel continued. She said she didn't think she would see me until Christmas. Annie climbed into the bed next to her and held her hand. And for the first time in months, my wife slept without waking up in pain. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. I'm glad you went home, he said. Yes, sir, Samuel replied. I just called because I wanted to tell you I will come back to work as soon as my wife is stable. I gave my word. Daniel shook his head even though Samuel couldn't see him. Reed, we're going to talk about that later. Right now, your job is to be a husband and a father. The company will survive without you for a few days. Yes, sir, Samuel said, but I still wanted to say thank you. My daughter thinks you are. He hesitated, then gave a small, embarrassed laugh. She thinks you are some kind of hero now. Daniel almost smiled. I'm not a hero, Reed. I'm a businessman who should have asked more questions a long time ago. There was a pause on the line. Then Samuel said something that stayed with Daniel long after the call ended. Sir, most people in my position don't expect men in your position to ask questions. We just hope they are fair when it matters. After the call ended, Daniel stood in the hallway for a long time, looking out over the office floor below where hundreds of people were working, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, meetings starting and ending, numbers moving across screens. Most of those people would never meet him. Many of them would never speak to him. But their lives moved in small ways, according to decisions he made in quiet rooms, like the one he had just stepped out of. That realization felt heavier now than it ever had before. That evening, when Daniel returned home, he found Annie sitting at the large kitchen table with Margaret. A half-finished glass of milk sat in front of her, and a plate with a grilled cheese sandwich cut neatly into triangles. Margaret looked up as Daniel walked in. They're staying at the hospital tonight, she said. Samuel didn't want Annie to see her mother wake up confused again in the middle of the night, so I told him Annie could stay here with us. Daniel looked at Annie. Is that okay with you? Annie nodded politely. Yes, sir. Mrs. Whitmore said I could sleep in one of the guest rooms. You don't have to call me sir in this house, Daniel said. You can call me Mr. Whitmore, or Daniel. Annie thought about that very seriously, as if it were an important decision. Okay, Mr. Daniel, she said. Margaret smiled softly and went back to making tea. Daniel sat down at the table across from Annie. Up close, he noticed again how careful she was with everything, how she held the glass with both hands, how she sat straight in the chair, how she watched adults' faces before speaking, like she was always making sure she wasn't causing trouble. "Did you talk to your mother today?" he asked. Annie nodded. Yes, she was happy today. She smiled a lot. "That's good. She said to tell you thank you," Annie added. "She said she knows important people are very busy, so for you to help us means you must be very kind." Daniel did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded once. They sat in silence for a minute. Then Annie asked a question that surprised him. "Mr. Daniel, are you very rich?" Margaret glanced over quickly, but Daniel answered without hesitation. "Yes," he said. "I am." Annie considered that. "Then you must have a lot of important things to do every day." "I do," Daniel said. She nodded again, as if confirming something in her mind. "Then thank you for using your important time to help my family." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. In boardrooms, people thanked him for investments, partnerships, deals, donations, speeches. They thanked him because they wanted something, or because it was polite, or because it was business. But this child was thanking him for giving her father permission to go sit beside her mother's hospital bed. That was the moment Daniel began to understand that power was not just about what you could build, buy, or control. It was also about the small decisions you made that could change the direction of someone else's life completely, and how easily those decisions could be made if you simply decided to care. Later that night, after Annie had gone upstairs with Margaret to see the guest room, Daniel walked into his study and sat down alone. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty in the same way it had before. On his desk were two things: Samuel Reed's contract and a blank notepad. Daniel Whitmore, billionaire, CEO, builder of a company worth more than most towns, sat in his study and began writing a list by hand. Employee emergency fund, contract review committee, mandatory family leave policy, direct reporting line for employee grievances, education fund for employees' children. He stopped writing and looked at the list. 2 days ago, none of this had been on his agenda. 2 days ago, Annie Reed had just been a name he had never heard, the daughter of a driver he barely knew, living a life completely separate from his own. Now, because a child had stood at his gate and asked him for help, he was rewriting parts of the system he had spent 20 years building. Daniel leaned back in his chair and thought about something Samuel had said on the phone. "We just hope they are fair when it matters." Daniel Whitmore looked around his large, quiet study and realized that for the first time in many years, he was not thinking about profit, expansion, or competition. He was thinking about whether or not he had been fair, and whether or not, from this point forward, he intended to be. The next morning, Daniel woke earlier than usual. For years, his mornings had followed the same pattern. Wake up at 6. Read financial reports, check overseas markets, scan emails, quick breakfast, car by 7:30. Every minute had a purpose. Every hour had a result. That was how he had built his life, one controlled day after another. But this morning, when he walked into the kitchen, he found Annie already sitting at the table, her feet not quite touching the floor, a bowl of cereal in front of her. She sat very straight when she saw him, like a student when a teacher walks into the room. "Good morning, Mr. Daniel," she said. "Good morning, Annie," he replied. Margaret stood at the counter pouring coffee. "She's been up since 6, Margaret said quietly. She said she didn't want to be asleep when her father called. Daniel nodded and sat at the table. "Did he call yet?" Annie shook her head. "Not yet. But he said he would call this morning before the doctors come." Daniel poured himself coffee and sat across from her. For a few minutes, the only sound in the kitchen was the soft clink of a spoon against a bowl and the low hum of the refrigerator. "Are you worried?" Daniel asked. Annie nodded, then quickly added, "But Mama said worrying doesn't help, so I'm trying to be brave." Daniel looked at her carefully. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he said. "It just means you do what you have to do even when you are." Annie seemed to think about that very seriously, as if she were storing the sentence somewhere important in her mind. At that moment, Margaret's phone rang. She looked at the screen and smiled slightly. "It's Samuel," she said, then handed the phone to Annie. "It's your father." Annie slid off the chair and took the phone with both hands. "Daddy?" Daniel and Margaret pretended not to listen, but in a quiet kitchen, it was impossible not to hear at least part of the conversation. Yes, I'm at the big house. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore made me cereal. Is Mama awake? Can you tell her I love her? I love you too, Daddy. When Annie handed the phone back, her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Mama ate breakfast today, she said. The doctor said, that's a good sign. That is a good sign, Margaret said warmly. Daniel checked his watch. I have to go to the office, he said. Then he looked at Annie. Would you like to come with me today? Annie's eyes widened. To your work? Yes. She looked at Margaret, unsure if she was allowed to say yes. Margaret smiled. I think that would be fine. You can sit in Daniel's office and draw or read while he works. Annie looked back at Daniel. I won't be noisy, she said quickly. I can be very quiet. Daniel almost smiled. I know, he said. An hour later, Annie sat in the back seat of Daniel's car, looking out the window as they drove toward the city. She had never seen buildings this tall up close before. Her face stayed close to the glass, her eyes moving from bridges to trains to people walking quickly along sidewalks. When they arrived at the Whitmore building, Daniel led her through the lobby. People greeted him immediately. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. The board packet is on your desk. The 10 a.m. meeting has been moved, but many of them paused when they saw Annie walking beside him. In the elevator, Annie stood very still, watching the numbers light up one by one. Is this whole building yours? She asked quietly. No, Daniel said. But a lot of people work here with me. When the elevator doors opened to the executive floor, Daniel led her into his office. It was a large room with glass walls, a city view, a long desk, and a sitting area near the window. You can sit here, Daniel said, pointing to the small table near the window. If you need anything, ask my assistant, Mark. Yes, Mr. Daniel, Annie said. For the next hour, Daniel tried to work, but he found himself distracted. Through the glass wall, he could see Annie sitting quietly, drawing on a notepad Mark had given her. She didn't touch anything on his desk. She didn't wander around the office. She just sat and drew, occasionally looking out the window at the city below. Around 11, Daniel had a meeting with several department heads about the new employee policies he had announced the day before. Annie remained at the small table while the meeting took place in the office. This will increase short-term costs, the CFO was saying, but long-term it may improve retention and company reputation. Richard Cole sat across the table, his expression controlled but clearly unhappy. We are setting a dangerous precedent, he said. Employees will start expecting emotional considerations instead of professional ones. Daniel replied calmly, Employees are human beings, Richard, not machinery. Richard glanced briefly toward Annie, who was quietly drawing and not paying attention to the meeting. With respect, Daniel, you built this company by being rational, not emotional. Daniel followed his gaze and looked at Annie too. She was drawing a picture of 3 people holding hands in front of a small house. Daniel turned back to the table. Maybe it's time the company learned how to be both. The meeting ended with no one openly arguing, but Daniel could feel the tension in the room. Change always made people uncomfortable, especially people who benefited from the old system. After everyone left, Daniel walked over to Annie's table. What are you drawing? He asked. She turned the paper toward him. This is my mama, and this is my daddy, and this is me, she said, pointing to each stick figure carefully. This is our house. It's small, but Mama says it's full of love. So it's a big house in a different way. Daniel looked at the drawing longer than he expected to. A big house in a different way, he repeated quietly. Annie nodded, satisfied that he understood. Daniel Whitmore stood in his glass office high above the city, holding a child's drawing of a tiny house with 3 people holding hands, and realized that for most of his life, he had been trying to build the wrong kind of big house. That afternoon, after Annie finished her drawing, Daniel had Mark arrange a car to take them to the hospital. I have one more meeting, Daniel told her, kneeling slightly so he was at her eye level. After that, we'll go see your mother. Would you like that? Annie nodded immediately. Yes, Mr. Daniel. Mama will be happy to see you. Daniel wasn't sure about that. He had never been particularly comfortable in hospitals. They reminded him too much of the years when he was young and poor and hospitals meant bills, fear, and long nights in plastic chairs. But he nodded anyway. "Then we'll go together," he said. By late afternoon, they were walking through the quiet halls of St. Mary's Medical Center. The smell of antiseptic and the soft beeping of machines filled the air. Nurses moved quickly but gently, and voices were kept low, as if everyone understood that hospitals were places where life could change in a single conversation. Annie walked slightly ahead now because she knew the room number. When they reached the door, she stopped and looked back at Daniel. "Mama gets tired fast," she said, "but she smiles when Daddy is there." Daniel nodded. "Okay." Annie pushed the door open gently. Samuel Reed was sitting beside the bed, leaning forward, his large hand wrapped carefully around his wife's much thinner one. He looked up when they entered, surprised. "Sir," he said, starting to stand. Daniel shook his head. "Sit down, Reed." Samuel nodded and sat again. In the bed, Annie's mother turned her head slowly. She looked weak, but her eyes were clear and warm. Annie walked straight to her and climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed. "Mama, this is Mr. Daniel," Annie said softly. "He's the one I told you about. He let Daddy come home." Mrs. Reed looked at Daniel for a long moment, then gave a small smile. "So you're the man my husband has been driving around for 2 years, she said, her voice thin but steady. Daniel stepped closer to the bed. "Yes, ma'am." "Then I owe you a thank you," she said. Daniel shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." She smiled slightly. "Maybe not. But I'm going to say thank you anyway, because last night was the first night in a long time I slept without being afraid." The room was quiet after that. Daniel did not know what to say, so he just nodded once. Samuel spoke quietly. "Sir, came to see how you're doing." Mrs. Reed looked at Daniel again. "You must be a very busy man." "I am," Daniel said. "And you still came here," she said. "That means either you are very kind, or my daughter is very stubborn." Annie smiled a little. "Mama," Mrs. Reed squeezed her hand gently. "Both can be true," she said. They talked for a few minutes more. Nothing dramatic, just small things. The doctor's plan, the treatment schedule, how Annie was doing in school, normal conversation, but it felt important in a way Daniel could not explain. At one point, Mrs. Reed looked at her husband and said, "Samuel, you look less tired today." Samuel smiled slightly. "I slept in a chair next to you. That's better than sleeping anywhere else." Daniel watched the way they looked at each other, the quiet understanding between them. He had been in rooms with billion-dollar deals and men who controlled entire industries. But he realized now that power did not always look like boardrooms and contracts. Sometimes it looked like a man holding his wife's hand in a hospital room and refusing to leave. After a while, the nurse came in and said Mrs. Reed needed to rest. Annie hugged her mother carefully. Samuel kissed his wife's forehead. Daniel stepped back toward the door. "Mr. Whitmore," Mrs. Reed said softly before he left. Daniel turned. "Please take care of my husband when he comes back to work," she said. "He won't ask for anything. He never does." Daniel looked at Samuel, then back at her. "I know," Daniel said. "That's part of the problem." She smiled slightly, as if she understood exactly what he meant. When they stepped out into the hallway, Annie slipped her hand into Daniel's without saying anything. He looked down, a little surprised, but he didn't pull his hand away. "Thank you for coming," Annie said quietly as they walked toward the elevator. "Mama was nervous to meet you. She thought maybe very rich people don't like meeting people like us." Daniel pressed the elevator button and looked down at her. "People like us?" he asked. She nodded. "People who don't have much money." The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "Annie," he said, "when I was a little older than you, my mother and I lived in one room behind a grocery store. We didn't have much money either." Annie looked up at him, surprised. "Really?" "Yes," he said. "Really." "Then, you're like us," she said, trying to understand. Daniel thought about that as the elevator went down. "I used to be," he said. "I just forgot for a while." That night, after he drove Annie back to the house and Margaret helped her get ready for bed, Daniel sat alone in his study again. But this time, he wasn't looking at contracts or financial reports. He was thinking about something Mrs. Reed had said, "He won't ask for anything." He never does. Daniel realized that the most loyal people were often the ones who asked for the least, worked the hardest, and suffered the most quietly. And people like him, people at the top, often rewarded the loudest voices, the most aggressive negotiators, the people who demanded more, not the people who simply carried the company on their backs without complaint. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark lawn and the closed iron gates in the distance. A few days ago, a girl had stood outside those gates because she believed the man who lived behind them was fair. Now Daniel Whitmore understood that being fair was not something you said about yourself, and it was not something written in a company handbook. It was something you proved in moments when you had the power to help someone who could offer you nothing in return. And he was beginning to realize that those moments might be the ones that defined his life more than any business deal ever would. When Daniel and Annie returned to the Whitmore house that night, the sky was already dark, and the house lights glowed warmly through the tall windows. For the first time since Annie had arrived, she did not look nervous when she walked inside. She took off her shoes neatly near the door, the way Margaret had shown her, and thanked the housekeeper who brought her a glass of warm milk. Daniel watched these small things without saying anything. He had spent most of his life around adults who tried to impress him, negotiate with him, or avoid him. Watching a child try so hard to be polite in a house that was not hers made him feel something unfamiliar, something like responsibility, but deeper than that. After Annie went upstairs to call her father, Margaret walked into Daniel's study and leaned lightly against the door. "She asked me tonight if it's expensive to live in a house this big," Margaret said. Daniel looked up from the papers on his desk. "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes," Margaret said. "And then she asked how many people have to work so one family can live like this." Daniel did not respond immediately. Margaret studied her husband for a moment. "She's not like most children," she said. "No," Daniel said quietly. "She isn't." Margaret walked over and sat in the chair across from him. "Daniel, what are you really thinking? Because I can see it on your face, you're not just helping this one family. You're thinking about something bigger." Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at the list he had written the night before the employee fund, the new policies, the contract reviews. "When I was young," Daniel said slowly, "I used to think rich people were a different species, like they lived in another world with different rules, and I promised myself that if I ever became one of them, I would never forget what it felt like to be on the other side of the gate." Margaret listened quietly. "I think," Daniel continued, "somewhere along the way, I didn't forget. I just stopped looking." Margaret nodded. "Success does that. It builds walls slowly. You don't notice them until someone knocks on the door." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Or stands outside the gate for 3 hours. They were both quiet for a moment. Upstairs, Annie's small voice could be heard faintly through the hallway as she talked on the phone with her father. She was telling him about the big office, the tall buildings, the grilled cheese sandwich Margaret made, and how her mother smiled that afternoon. "She makes everything sound like an adventure," Margaret said softly. Daniel nodded. "Children do that. They turn survival into adventure so it doesn't feel like fear." Margaret looked at him carefully when he said that, but she didn't ask what memory he was thinking about. The next day, Daniel asked Mark to bring him a list of all employees who had taken advance salary in the past 5 years. When the folder arrived, it was thicker than he expected. He opened the file and began reading names, positions, reasons for advances, medical bills, house fire, immigration lawyer, child surgery, funeral costs, flood damage, cancer treatment. Each line was a small disaster in someone's life, and next to each disaster was a contract, a repayment schedule, and in some cases, restrictions Daniel had never personally approved but had existed under his company name. Around noon, Ethan walked into the office again. "You look like you just discovered something you don't like," Ethan said. Daniel closed the file slowly. "I discovered that our company has been making very good business decisions and very questionable human decisions at the same time." Ethan sat down across from him. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he admitted. "About structure and humanity." "And?" Daniel asked. "I think I understand now," Ethan said. "It's easy to make rules when you're not the one those rules are trapping." Daniel nodded once. "Yes, that's exactly right." Ethan hesitated, then said, "I want to help with the new employee fund. Not just sign papers. I want to actually work on it." Daniel looked at his son for a long moment. "Why?" Ethan shrugged slightly, but his voice was more serious than usual. Because yesterday, when that girl held your sleeve and asked you to help her father, I realized something. If I had been the one standing here alone, I would have told her no and walked back into the house. And I don't like what that says about me." Daniel did not speak for a moment. Then he said quietly, "The good news is that you noticed. Some men go their whole lives without noticing." Ethan nodded slowly. That afternoon, Daniel received another call from Samuel. "Sir, the doctor says my wife can go home in a few days if she continues to improve," Samuel said. "They want to continue treatment as an outpatient." "That's good news," Daniel said. "Yes, sir. Annie told me she went to your office yesterday. She said you have a very big window." Daniel almost smiled. "Yes, I do." There was a short silence. Then Samuel said something carefully, as if he had been thinking about it for a long time. "Sir, I hope you know I never took advantage of the advance. I worked every hour they asked. I didn't want you to think I was trying to escape my responsibilities." Daniel's voice was calm. "Reed, listen to me. Taking care of your family is not escaping responsibility. It is responsibility." Samuel did not answer for a moment. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." After the call ended, Daniel sat in his office looking out over the city again. A week ago, Samuel Reed had just been a driver. Annie had just been a child in a small house in another city. Mrs. Reed had just been a name on an HR form requesting medical leave. Now their lives were connected to his in a way that could not be undone. Daniel Whitmore had spent years believing that power meant control. Control over outcomes, over markets, over negotiations, over risk. But Annie had shown up at his gate with nothing, no money, no influence, no contract, no power at all, and she had changed the direction of his company in a single morning simply because she asked for help and believed he would give it. And Daniel was beginning to understand that there were two kinds of power in this world. The power that comes from money, and the power that comes from being the kind of person someone can come to when they have nowhere else to go. For the first time in a very long time, Daniel Whitmore decided he wanted to be the second kind of powerful man. 2 days later, Samuel's wife was discharged from the hospital. Daniel did not plan to go, but that morning he found himself asking Mark to clear his afternoon schedule anyway. He told himself it was because Samuel was a valuable employee, and this was a difficult situation. He told himself it was because the company was changing policies, and he needed to understand the real impact of those policies. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the only reason. When Daniel's car pulled up in front of the small house where the Reed family lived, he understood something immediately. Annie had not exaggerated when she said the house was small. It was a narrow, aging house on a quiet street, where all the houses stood close together, their paint slightly faded, their porches filled with old chairs and potted plants. A bicycle lay on its side near the steps. A wind chime moved gently in the afternoon breeze. It was not the kind of place Daniel Whitmore had been inside for a very long time. Samuel opened the front door before Daniel even reached it, as if he had been watching through the window. "Sir," Samuel said, clearly surprised. "You didn't have to come." Daniel nodded once. "I was in the area. It was not true." And both men knew it. But Samuel did not argue. Inside, the house was clean but worn. The furniture was old but carefully maintained. Family photos covered one wall: Annie as a baby, Annie on her first day of school, Samuel and his wife standing in front of the same house years ago, all of them smiling like people who did not have much, but were proud of what they did have. Mrs. Reed was sitting in a chair near the window with a blanket over her knees. She looked tired, but much stronger than she had in the hospital. "Mr. Whitmore," she said with a warm smile, "welcome to our home." Daniel nodded politely. "Thank you for letting me visit." Annie ran in from the kitchen. "Mr. Daniel, Mama came home today, I heard," Daniel said. "That's very good news." Mrs. Reed gestured toward the small dining table. "Samuel made coffee. We don't have the kind you probably drink, but it's hot." Daniel almost smiled. "Hot coffee is good coffee," he said. They sat at the small table together. Daniel Whitmore, billionaire; Samuel Reed, driver; Mrs. Reed, recovering patient; and Annie, who sat very straight in her chair like this, was the most important dinner of her life. For a while they talked about simple things: medication schedules, follow-up appointments, Annie's school, the weather, normal conversation. But underneath it, Daniel could feel something else: dignity. This family did not ask him for money. They did not ask him for favors. They did not complain about the contract or the long hours or the 2 years Samuel had spent mostly away from home. They were simply grateful that he had let a husband go home to his wife. At one point, Mrs. Reed looked at Daniel and said, "My husband told me you're changing some policies at your company." Daniel nodded. "Yes." She studied him for a moment. "Then I hope you know something," she said. "What's that?" Daniel asked. "Men like my husband are very proud," she said. "They don't ask for help because they don't want to feel like they owe anyone. So when they take an advance, they will work twice as hard, suffer twice as quietly, and never complain. Not because they are weak, but because they are trying to keep their word." Samuel looked down at the table, embarrassed, but he did not disagree. Mrs. Reed continued, her voice gentle but very clear. "So if you want to be a good boss to men like that, you cannot wait for them to tell you when something is wrong, because they won't. You have to look. You have to ask. And sometimes, you have to protect them even from their own pride." Daniel sat very still, listening to every word. "I think," she said finally, "that's what real leadership is. Not just making sure the company survives, but making sure the people who help you build it survive too." No one spoke for a few seconds after that. Annie broke the silence in the way only a child could. "Mama says Daddy is the strongest man she knows," Annie said. "But Mama says even strong people need help sometimes. They just don't like to say it." Daniel looked at Samuel. For the first time since he had known him, he did not see just a driver in a uniform. He saw a man who had been carrying fear, debt, exhaustion, and responsibility for 2 years without letting it show in his voice even once. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and placed an envelope on the table. Samuel looked at it but did not touch it. "Sir, I can't take—" "It's not a gift," Daniel said calmly. "It's the difference between what you were paid under that contract and what you should have been paid under a fair one. Consider it a correction." Samuel stared at the envelope, then at Daniel. "Sir, you earned it," Daniel said simply. Mrs. Reed placed her hand gently over her husband's. "Take it," she said quietly. "Not because we need charity, but because sometimes accepting fairness is also a way of keeping your dignity." Samuel swallowed and finally nodded. "Thank you, sir." They sat there a little longer, talking about Annie's school and Samuel's plan to return to work part-time at first while his wife recovered. When Daniel finally stood to leave, Annie walked him to the door. "Mr. Daniel," she said, "Mama says when someone helps you when they don't have to, you should never forget it." Daniel looked down at her. "And what do you think?" he asked. Annie thought for a moment. "I think when I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who can open big gates for people." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest again, that same feeling he had the first morning she stood outside his house. He nodded once. "That's a very good goal, Annie." As Daniel walked back to his car, he looked once more at the small house, the old porch, the wind chime moving in the afternoon light. For most of his life, he had believed he was building an empire. Standing on that small street, he began to realize that what he really wanted to build now was something much harder to measure, something called fairness, something called dignity, something called a life where a child would never again have to stand outside a gate and ask permission just to bring her father home. When Daniel returned to the office on Monday morning, he could feel the difference before anyone said a word. News traveled quietly but quickly inside a company, not through official emails or announcements, but through hallway conversations, break room whispers, drivers talking in parking lots, assistants talking in elevators, warehouse supervisors making phone calls after work. People always knew when something changed at the top, even if no one explained it. As Daniel walked through the executive floor, people greeted him the same way they always did. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." But there was something else now, something he had not seen directed at him in a long time. They were looking at him, not just working for him. In his office, Mark was already waiting with a folder. "The new policy draft is ready," he said. "HR and legal worked all weekend on it." Daniel took the folder and sat down. The document was titled, "Employee Advance and Emergency Support Policy, Revised." He read slowly. "No employee who accepts a salary advance will be denied reasonable family or medical leave. All repayment schedules must be structured through payroll deduction only. No department may impose additional restrictions without executive review. Emergency Medical Assistance Fund established for employees and immediate family. Confidential review board for employee hardship cases. Daniel closed the folder. Good, he said. Send it to the board for formal approval. And after that, I want every employee to receive a copy. Not just managers. Everyone. Yes, sir, Mark said. Then he hesitated slightly. Sir, there's something else. What is it? Richard Cole requested a meeting with the board this morning. He's concerned about the financial impact of the new policies. Daniel nodded once. Of course he is. At 10 o'clock, Daniel walked into the boardroom. The long table was already filled board members, legal advisors, senior executives, and Richard Cole sitting halfway down the table with a stack of printed reports in front of him. Richard stood when Daniel entered. Daniel, he said, polite but firm. Before the board votes on these new policies, I think we need to discuss the cost. Daniel took his seat at the head of the table. Go ahead. Richard handed out copies of a financial report. If we loosen advance repayment restrictions and add paid emergency leave, we increase company liability. If we create a medical assistance fund, that's direct cost. Over time, this could cost the company millions. One of the board members, an older man named Harris, adjusted his glasses. Is that number accurate? Richard nodded. Yes. We are essentially taking on employee personal risk that was previously controlled through contract enforcement. Daniel folded his hands on the table. Let me ask you a question, Richard. How much does it cost to replace a trained employee? Richard frowned slightly. That depends on the position. Drivers, warehouse supervisors, mechanics, Daniel said. Average cost. Richard hesitated. Training, hiring, lost productivity. Maybe 30 to 50,000 per employee. Daniel nodded. And how many employees do we lose each year because of burnout, family emergencies, or personal crises they can't manage while working full-time schedules? No one answered immediately, so Mark spoke. Last year, across all departments, about 120 employees left for what HR classified as personal hardship reasons. Daniel looked around the table. 120 employees multiplied by even $30,000 is $3.6 million a year in replacement costs. He let that number sit in the room for a moment. The emergency fund and policy changes will cost less than that, Daniel continued. So if you want to talk about cost, let's talk about the real cost of ignoring the people who keep this company running. Richard said nothing. Daniel continued, his voice calm but steady. But this is not just about money. This is about what kind of company we are. Do we want employees who work for us because they are afraid to lose their job? Or do we want employees who work for us because they know we will stand with them when life goes wrong? The older board member, Harris, leaned back in his chair. My father ran a factory, he said slowly. He used to say the same thing. He said if you take care of your workers when they're in trouble, they'll take care of your business when you're in trouble. Another board member nodded. Employee loyalty is not something you can buy with salary alone. Richard looked around the room and realized the conversation was no longer going his way. Daniel leaned forward slightly. I am not asking whether we can afford to do this, he said. I am telling you we cannot afford not to. The room was quiet for a few seconds. Then Harris spoke again. I think we should vote. One by one, the board members raised their hands. The policy passed. After the meeting ended and everyone began to leave the room, Richard approached Daniel. You're changing the culture of this company, Richard said. Daniel nodded. Yes. Richard studied him for a moment. All because of one driver and his kid? Daniel looked at him calmly. No, because of a system that allowed a good man to believe he had to choose between his job and his family. Richard didn't reply. He just nodded once and walked away. That evening, Daniel returned home later than usual. Annie was at the kitchen table doing homework Margaret had helped print from her school website. She looked up when Daniel walked in. Mr. Daniel, she said, I got all my spelling words right today. That's impressive, Daniel said. Spelling was never my best subject. Annie smiled a little. Mama says words are important because they tell people who you are. Daniel loosened his tie and sat down at the table across from her. Your mother sounds like a very smart woman. Annie nodded seriously. She says you can tell what kind of person someone is by how they treat people who can't do anything for them. Daniel was quiet for a moment after that. Earlier that day, he had convinced a board of directors to approve a policy that would change thousands of employees' lives. It had taken financial reports, arguments, and a formal vote. But the reason he had done it came down to something much simpler, a child who believed powerful people should help when they can. "How is your mother feeling today?" he asked. "Better," Annie said. "Daddy says she walked from the bed to the chair today. The doctor said that's progress." "That is progress," Daniel said. Annie looked at him for a moment, then asked, "Mr. Daniel, are you going to fire my daddy because he left work?" Daniel looked at her, surprised. "Why would you think that?" She shrugged slightly. "Some people at Daddy's work told him bosses don't like when workers leave." Daniel leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "No, Annie. I'm not going to fire your father. Your father is one of the reasons my company works as well as it does." Annie seemed to relax a little after hearing that. "Good," she said, "because Mama says a man who keeps his word should never be punished for loving his family." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. In the boardroom that morning, he had talked about cost, retention, and company culture. But sitting at the kitchen table that night, listening to a child repeat what her mother had taught her, Daniel realized the entire decision could have been explained much more simply. A company should never punish a good man for loving his family. And from that day on, Daniel Whitmore made a quiet promise to himself that as long as he was in charge, no one who worked for him would ever again have to choose between the two. The change did not happen all at once. Companies never changed all at once. They changed the way seasons changed quietly at first. Then all at once, when you suddenly realized the air felt different. Within 2 weeks of the new policy, something unusual started happening across Whitmore Logistics and Security. Employees who had never spoken in meetings began speaking. Drivers who usually left immediately after their shift began stopping by the office to ask questions. Warehouse supervisors started sending emails with suggestions instead of complaints. It was as if someone had opened a window in a building that had been closed for a long time. Daniel noticed it in small ways first. One morning, when he arrived at the garage, 3 drivers who normally just nodded quickly actually said, "Good morning, sir," and looked him in the eye when they said it. Not with fear, not with forced politeness, with something closer to respect. That was new. Later that same day, Mark came into Daniel's office holding a stack of letters. Actual letters. Handwritten. "What are these?" Daniel asked. "Employees," Mark said. "Some of them heard about the new emergency fund and the contract changes. They wanted to say thank you." Daniel looked at the letters but didn't open them yet. "How many?" Mark glanced at the stack. "This is just from the Stamford office and the garage staff. There are more coming from the warehouse locations." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "I didn't do it for thank you letters." "I know," Mark said. "But I think for some of them, this is the first time they feel like someone at the top even knows they exist." After Mark left, Daniel opened one of the letters. It was written in careful handwriting. "Mr. Whitmore, my name is Luis Hernandez. I work night shift in Warehouse 3. Last year my son broke his leg and I almost quit because I couldn't work and take care of him at the same time. If this new policy existed last year, my family would have had a much easier time. Thank you for thinking about people like us." Daniel read the letter twice, then set it down and opened another. "Sir, I have worked for this company for 11 years. No one has ever asked if we were okay before. Thank you for asking now." Daniel sat there for a long time. The letters spread across his desk, and realized something that surprised him. For 20 years, he had been respected because he was powerful. Now, for the first time, he was being respected because he had been fair. That evening, when he returned home, he found Annie in the living room doing homework, while Ethan sat on the couch across from her with a laptop. "What are you two working on?" Daniel asked. "Math," Ethan said. "And I forgot how hard 3rd grade math is when you have to explain it to someone else." Annie looked up. "He's not very good at explaining," she said very seriously. Ethan looked offended. "I am very good at explaining. You just don't listen." "I listen," Annie said. "You just skip steps because you already know the answer." Daniel sat down in a chair nearby, watching them. "Show me the problem," he said. Annie turned the notebook toward him. It was a simple division problem, but she had written the numbers very carefully, erasing and rewriting until they were neat. Daniel picked up the pencil. "The trick," he said, "is not to rush. You solve it step by step." He worked through the problem slowly, explaining each step. Annie watched closely, nodding. When he finished, she smiled. "You're better than him," she said, pointing at Ethan. Ethan shook his head. Great. Now I'm being replaced by my own father in elementary school tutoring. Daniel handed Annie the pencil. Try the next one. She worked carefully, her tongue slightly pressed against her lip in concentration, then looked up. I did it. Daniel checked the answer and nodded. You did. She smiled again, proud but still quiet about it. After a few minutes, Annie asked a question without looking up from her notebook. Mr. Daniel, what did you want to be when you were a kid? Daniel thought about that for a moment. I wanted to be someone who didn't have to worry about money, he said. Annie looked up. Did you do it? Yes, Daniel said. I did. She nodded, then asked, Are you happy you did it? Daniel did not answer right away. That was not a question business magazines asked him. That was not a question board members asked him. That was not a question he asked himself very often. I think, Daniel said slowly, I was so busy trying to succeed that I didn't think enough about what I was succeeding for. Annie seemed to think about that very carefully. My mama says work is important, Annie said. But she says people are more important than work, because work ends when you go home, but people are the reason you go home. Daniel felt that same tight feeling in his chest again. Across the room, Ethan was watching his father, listening very carefully to this conversation. Annie, Daniel said after a moment, when your mother gets stronger and things go back to normal, what do you want to do? Annie shrugged a little. I want to help my mama and my daddy. And I want to do good in school. And maybe one day I want to have a job where I can help people who are scared. What kind of job is that? Ethan asked. Annie thought for a moment. Maybe a doctor, or a teacher, or maybe someone who opens gates. Daniel and Ethan both looked at her. Opens gates? Ethan asked. She nodded. Not just real gates. Life gates. When people are stuck and can't go forward, someone should open the gate for them. The room was quiet after that. Daniel Whitmore, who owned more buildings than he could count and had signed contracts worth more money than Annie could imagine, sat in his own living room and realized that everything he had been trying to build for 30 years could be described in a much simpler way than he had ever used before. Not an empire, not a corporation, just a place where, when someone stood at the gate and knocked, there would be someone inside willing to open it. The following week, something unexpected happened that Daniel Whitmore had not planned for and could not measure on a financial report. Samuel Reed returned to work. Not full-time yet, Daniel had insisted on that, but part-time, a few hours a day, mostly short drives, mostly local. When Samuel walked into the garage that first morning, the other drivers looked up from their coffee cups and conversations slowly stopped. Not because Samuel was important in the company hierarchy, because everyone knew what had happened. Men who had worked beside him for years walked over and shook his hand. One of the mechanics patted him on the shoulder. Someone said, How's your wife? Another said, We heard the boss changed the policy because of you. Samuel shook his head immediately. Not because of me, he said. Because he decided to. But the men looked at him in a different way now. Not with jealousy. With something closer to pride. One of their own had been seen. One of their own had been treated like his life mattered. Upstairs, Daniel was in his office when Mark knocked and stepped in. Reed is back, Mark said. I know, Daniel replied. I saw the schedule. Mark hesitated, then said, You should know something else. Since the new policy was announced, employee resignation requests have dropped by almost 40%, and HR says productivity in the warehouse is actually up. Daniel looked up. Up? Yes, sir, Mark said. One supervisor said, and I quote, Turns out when people don't feel trapped, they work harder because they want to, not because they're afraid. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. He wasn't surprised, but hearing the numbers made it real in a different way. Sometimes the expensive decision is the cheap decision, Daniel said quietly. Mark smiled a little. I think you just created a management quote, sir. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked down to the garage instead of calling for the car. When he stepped inside, the room went quiet in the way it always did when the owner showed up unexpectedly. Samuel, who had been checking a vehicle log, looked up and immediately straightened. Sir. Daniel walked over to him. How is your wife? Stronger, Samuel said. She's walking a little every day now. Annie went back to school this morning. She didn't want to leave her mother, but her mother told her school is her job. Daniel nodded. Your hours will stay reduced for now. Family first, work later. Yes, sir, Samuel said. Then he hesitated. Sir, the men here, they keep saying I should thank you again, but I don't know how many times a man can say thank you without it sounding small compared to what you did. Daniel looked at him for a moment. Then don't thank me, Daniel said. Just keep doing what you've been doing for the last 2 years. Be a good driver. Be a good husband. Be a good father. That's enough. Samuel nodded, his eyes serious. Yes, sir. As Daniel turned to leave, he noticed something on the wall near the lockers, a small bulletin board where employees sometimes posted photos or notes. He walked closer. There were pictures of families, children, weddings, new babies, fishing trips, old parents, birthday cakes in small kitchens, high school graduation photos, normal lives, quiet lives, lives that had nothing to do with boardrooms or profit margins, but everything to do with why people woke up every morning and went to work. Daniel stood there looking at that board for a long time. Samuel stepped up beside him. We put pictures there so when work is hard, we remember why we're working, he said. Daniel nodded slowly. That makes sense. That evening, when Daniel got home, Annie ran into the hallway with a piece of paper in her hand. Mr. Daniel, look. He took the paper. It was another drawing. This time, it was a big gate, and the gate was open. On one side of the gate stood a small girl and a man in a driver's uniform. On the other side stood a tall man in a suit. Above the gate, she had written in big, careful letters, "Thank you for opening the gate." Daniel looked at the drawing for a long time. Do you like it? Annie asked. Yes, Daniel said quietly. I like it very much. She pointed at the tall man in the drawing. That's you. And who is this? He asked, pointing at the small girl. That's me, she said. Then she pointed at the man beside the girl. And that's my daddy. Daniel nodded. And this, Annie said, pointing at the open gate, is the most important part. Why is that the most important part? Daniel asked. Because if the gate stays closed, Annie said, people on the outside feel like they don't matter. But when the gate opens, they feel like maybe the world is not as scary as they thought. Daniel swallowed slowly, then handed the drawing back to her. That's a very important drawing, he said. That night, after Annie had gone to bed and the house was quiet again, Daniel went into his study and sat at his desk. He looked at the drawing she had made, and then at the stack of company reports beside it. For most of his life, he had believed he was building something important because it was big. Now he was beginning to understand that something did not have to be big to be important. Sometimes the most important thing a man could do was something very small, like opening a gate at the right moment for the right person. Daniel Whitmore, billionaire, CEO, builder of a powerful company, sat alone in his study and realized that if he was remembered for anything after he was gone, he did not want it to be the size of his company. He wanted it to be the number of gates he had opened for people who thought they had reached the end of the road. And for the first time in many years, that felt like a goal big enough to spend the rest of his life trying to reach. A month passed, and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Samuel Reed returned to full-time work, but under a different schedule, one that allowed him to have dinner at home most nights and attend his wife's medical appointments twice a week. The new company policies had officially taken effect, and for the first time, employees began using something called family leave without whispering about it like it was a dangerous favor. Daniel noticed the change not in reports, but in faces. People looked less tired. They spoke more in meetings. Supervisors reported fewer mistakes in the warehouse. Drivers reported fewer accidents. HR reported fewer resignations. For years, Daniel had tried to improve performance with better systems, stricter rules, and tighter contracts. Now performance was improving because people were sleeping better at night. One afternoon, Daniel received an invitation in the mail. Not a corporate invitation printed on heavy paper with gold letters. Just a simple envelope with his name written carefully by hand. Inside was a small card. Mr. Whitmore, next Friday Annie's school is having a small ceremony. She is receiving an award. She would like very much if you could come. Thank you for everything. Samuel Reed and family. Daniel read the card twice, then placed it on his desk. He had been invited to hundreds of formal events, charity galas, business conferences, award dinners, political fundraisers. He attended some, skipped many, and forgot most of them. But this invitation felt different. Friday afternoon, Daniel told Mark he would be out of the office for 2 hours. Personal matter, he said. The school was small, a public elementary school with a brick building and a playground that had seen better years. Children's drawings were taped to the hallway walls. The smell of cafeteria food and floor cleaner filled the air. Daniel Whitmore, in a dark suit that probably cost more than the school's monthly supply budget, walked into the school auditorium and immediately felt out of place in a way he had not felt in years. Parents sat in folding chairs. Teachers stood near the stage holding clipboards. Children whispered and waved when they saw their families. Samuel spotted Daniel first and stood up quickly. "Sir," he said, surprised and grateful at the same time. "You came. You invited me," Daniel said simply. Mrs. Reed was sitting beside him, still thin but much healthier now, her hair beginning to grow back. She smiled warmly. "Annie is very excited you're here," she said. A few minutes later, the ceremony began. The principal walked onto the stage and began calling students up one by one for reading improvement, for math, for attendance, for kindness. For kindness, Daniel repeated quietly to himself. He had never heard of an award like that when he was in school. Then the principal said, "This next award is the Community Heart Award. It is given to a student who shows unusual courage, kindness, and care for others. This year, the award goes to Annie Reed." Daniel felt something in his chest as he watched Annie walk onto the stage. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly braided, her steps careful but confident. The principal knelt slightly so she was at Annie's height. "Annie," she said into the microphone, "your teacher told me what you did last month, how you took a bus across 2 towns by yourself because your mother was sick and you were trying to find your father so he could come home. That was very brave. But what impressed us most was not that you were brave. It was that you were brave because you love your family. And that is what this award is for." The room filled with applause. Annie accepted the small certificate with both hands, then looked out into the audience. Her eyes moved past the other parents, past the teachers, until she saw her mother, her father, and Daniel sitting beside them. She smiled when she saw them. After the ceremony, Annie ran over. "Mr. Daniel, did you see? I got the award." "I saw," Daniel said. "I'm very proud of you." She held up the certificate so he could read it. Then she said something quietly, so only he and her parents could hear. "I think I only got this because you opened the gate," she said. Daniel shook his head. "No, Annie, you got this because you were brave enough to knock on it." Samuel put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. Mrs. Reed wiped her eyes quietly. Other parents and teachers began to come over, curious about the tall man in the suit sitting with the Reed family. Someone asked what he did for a living. Annie answered before Daniel could. "He opens gates," she said proudly. The adults smiled, not fully understanding, but Daniel understood. That night, back at home, Daniel sat in his study again, looking at Annie's drawing of the open gate, and now the certificate she had insisted he take a copy of. For most of his life, he had measured success in numbers, revenue, profit, expansion, market share. But that afternoon, sitting in a small school auditorium watching a child receive an award for loving her family enough to be brave, Daniel realized there was another way to measure success. Not by how many people worked for you, but by how many people's lives were better because you did. The night after Annie's school ceremony, Daniel Whitmore could not sleep. He sat in his study long after the house had gone quiet, Annie's drawing of the open gate on his desk and a copy of her school certificate beside it. Outside the window, the iron gates at the end of his long driveway were closed, just as they were every night, silent and still under the soft lights. For years, Daniel had believed those gates meant success, privacy, security, proof that he had made it far enough in life that the world could no longer reach him unless he allowed it. Now he understood something he had never understood before. Gates did not just keep people out, they also kept people in. The next morning at breakfast, Annie was quieter than usual. She stirred her cereal slowly, not really eating. "Is something wrong?" Margaret asked gently. Annie looked up, then looked at Daniel, then back at her bowl. "Mama says we might go home next week," she said. Margaret smiled. "That's good news, isn't it? Your mother is strong enough now." Annie nodded, but she didn't smile. "Yes, it's good." Daniel understood immediately. "But you don't want to leave," he said. Annie looked embarrassed, like she had been caught doing something wrong. "I want to go home," she said quickly. I will miss this house, and Mrs. Whitmore, and Ethan, and—" She stopped. "And me?" Daniel asked. She nodded, still looking down at her bowl. "Yes, Mr. Daniel." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Finish your breakfast. I'll drive you to school today." On the drive to school, Annie looked out the window most of the time, watching the trees and houses pass by. "Mr. Daniel," she said after a while, "when I grow up and have my own house, I think I won't have a gate." "Why not?" Daniel asked. "Because I don't want anyone to feel scared to come knock on my door," she said. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but her words stayed with him the entire day. That afternoon, after work, Daniel drove to a part of the city he had not visited in years. Not the business district, not the wealthy neighborhoods. He drove to the older parts of town where small houses sat close together and people fixed their own fences, and children rode bikes on cracked sidewalks. He parked the car and sat there for a long time, just looking. He thought about his mother, about the small room behind the grocery store, about nights when she pretended she wasn't hungry so he could eat more. He thought about the men who had given him small chances when he was young, an extra shift, a recommendation, a loan, advice, a door opened at the right moment. He had told himself for years that he had built everything alone. That was not true. Someone had opened gates for him too. He had just never called it that. The following weekend, Daniel asked Samuel and his wife and Annie to come to the house for dinner, not as employees, as guests. Samuel and his wife were nervous at first, but Margaret made it easy. She cooked herself instead of asking the staff to do it, and they all sat at the smaller dining table in the kitchen instead of the long formal dining room. Halfway through dinner, Annie looked around the big kitchen and said, "Mr. Daniel, this house is very big for just a few people." Daniel nodded. "Yes, it is." She thought for a moment, then said something very simple. "Maybe big houses are not supposed to be for just one family." The adults at the table looked at her. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked gently. Annie shrugged a little. "I don't know. I just think if someone has a very big house and other people have very small houses, maybe the big house is supposed to help the small houses sometimes." No one spoke for a few seconds after that. Later that night, after Samuel and his family had gone home, Daniel walked slowly through the large, quiet rooms of his house. The living room no one used. The dining room used only on holidays. The guest rooms that stayed empty most of the year. The long hallway, the closed doors, the silence. He walked all the way to the front door and opened it, stepping out onto the stone steps. In the distance, the iron gate stood under the lights. For a long time, he just stood there looking at them. Then he took out his phone and called Mark. "I want to start a foundation," Daniel said when Mark answered. "For what purpose?" Mark asked. Daniel looked at the gate as he answered. "For employees' families, medical help, education, emergency support, and I want a program where employees' children who work hard in school can get scholarships." Quietly, no publicity. "Yes, sir," Mark said. "And Mark," Daniel added, "I also want something else." "What's that?" "I want one day every year where this house is open," Daniel said, "for the families of the people who work for this company. A day where they can come here, bring their children, eat, walk the grounds, and see that the place where their mothers and fathers work is not a place that is closed to them." Mark was quiet for a moment. "That's not a normal corporate program, sir." Daniel looked at the gate one more time. "No," he said. "It's not." He ended the call and stood there a little longer in the night air. Behind him was a house that had once felt like a fortress. In front of him was a gate that no longer looked like a symbol of success. It looked like a responsibility. And Daniel Whitmore finally understood something that Annie had known from the very beginning. If you are lucky enough to live behind a gate, then you are also responsible for opening it when someone on the outside has nowhere else to go. That was the last lesson a little girl had come to teach a very rich man, and it was the lesson that changed the rest of his life. The story reminds us that many good people suffer in silence. They work hard, keep their promises, and never complain, even when life is very difficult. These people don't ask for help because they have dignity and pride. That is why true leaders, true bosses, and true human beings must learn to see what is not said, to hear what is not spoken, and to help before someone is forced to beg. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.